On its surface, margin of error in Red Rock is an unimpressive low ball, probably a little overgraded, and just doesn't fit into what most climbers would call proud, me included. But I did find the boulder really fun, and I also found it really valuable. And since we're in the midst of a few months of examining movement and skill acquisition, I pulled this video out because it's a really great example of useful constraints that lead to unique solutions. In this case, a move I had never seen, which we jokingly called the figure 6. Let's get into it. So if you haven't been following along with the podcast and newsletter, here's the 60-second primer. There are two main theoretical approaches to skill acquisition: information processing and ecological dynamics. And information processing is what most of us are taught, that we have some computer inside of our heads storing our movement, and we rifle through all those little cards and pull out the motor program when we need it. And the better we get, the faster we get at rifling through all the cards. Ecological dynamics says that we aren't storing anything, but instead our actions are always informed and always coupled with our perception of our environment. Similar to the way that birds react to each other in a murmuration. That they aren't some separate mental file of motor programs. And that debate is an entirely different episode. But for what we're talking about today on the ecological side, the common approach to coaching movement is known as the Constraint Led approach. Rather than being informed about the mechanics of a movement and given explicit instruction and then asked to execute it, which we are actually quite bad at, the coach puts a constraint into place that renders a specific solution ineffective, and ideally then guides the athlete into finding the desired solution. Now, in the case of margin of error, it's comically lowball. That's its main constraint, that you have to fit into this little narrow space, or you dab, or actually you end up more like just lying on the ground. And it's certainly the case that the crux of the boulder is not dabbing, and that can seem really stupid. I get it. It can be a reason not to even do a boulder. But if we're looking at it from a learning perspective, it's a really useful constraint. Having the ground be so close forces the climber to stay tight and close to the roof. And we all can imagine scenarios where it's to our benefit to stay tight and not sag away. And I'm not saying here that it simply asks you to engage your core. For me, it was about finding new movement solutions that allowed me to stay tight. Yes, I'm engaging my core to stay tight, but I'm also finding new techniques or putting myself in new positions in order to stay that way. I had to add more control into the equation because had the roof been 6 feet off the ground, I would have climbed it entirely differently. But the low ball constraint led to me finding a different solution, a thing that I had never seen before. Now, I was climbing on margin of error with my friend Josh Muller, who is a Canadian climber, gym owner. He's climbed a bunch of V14s, and we were both having trouble finding a satisfactory solution for the first move. We'd seen video of people doing heel hooks. That really wasn't working for us inside that little box. I needed to sag a little more for the heel hook to work. But it occurred to me that if I put myself into a position I'd never done before, I'd never seen, that maybe I could get my arm out of my own way and make this move work. And it worked first try. Josh thought it looked ridiculous, but tried it anyway, and it worked for him first try as well. And that's the method he used to send the boulder a few goes before I did. And we jokingly called this move the figure 6. And here's the thing about it. I'd never seen it. I didn't have some motor program in my head that I was rifling to find telling me how to do it or in what scenario it would work. I ended up at that solution entirely because of the constraints given. As coaches, we often think if a climber doesn't know a technique, we have to tell them about that technique. They can never find it on their own. And I've been guilty of agreeing with this idea, but it's just not true. Someone did a knee bar before we called it a knee bar. Somebody did a drop knee before we called it a drop knee. I've seen kids stem up doorways. So have you. They don't know what stemming is. I see my 19-month-old mantle onto the couch all the time with perfect mantle technique that she's never been taught. Because solutions emerge based on the constraints given. And that might just be a better way to teach and a better way to learn. Luckily, climbing does that for us a lot, giving us new constraints, different constraints, and asking us to find movement solutions. But sometimes those boulders, those routes that you think are not valuable because they're not proud, they're some little lowball dirt burglar, they might just be more valuable than you think. All right. Like I said, we're in the midst of several months of digging into movement, and we're doing that across all of our channels, the podcast, the blog, the Instagram, here on YouTube. And if you want to follow along, I'll be collecting and connecting those dots in our newsletter, The Current, and you can subscribe to that and find links to all of those channels right there in the description below. Consider subscribing and going down some of those rabbit holes, and together we can all learn, grow, and excel.